Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Insights. And today we have with us once again Dennis Zimmer, CTO of Codenotary. Dennis, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Sabna. Great to be on the show again.
Yeah, and today we're going to talk about one aspect of blockchain that we don't often talk about or don't want to look at or don't look at, especially given the change in geopolitical situation in Europe, where countries can turn off the internet. And I just want to understand, what will be the impact on these kind of technologies in the new, kind of world order. So let's look at not the brighter side, but a bit of a darker side of blockchain that we don't often talk about.
I would say one of the important parts to start with is what everybody wants to have, and why also the blockchain technology became so prominent is the fact of immutability. So that you don't need an intermediate anymore. You basically can be sure something that is written to a blockchain can never be changed, can never be manipulated, and the technology you are building on is not just a pure blockchain technology, it's also distributed ledger technology. So it's typically distributed in ideally different continents, very definitely different data centers. And currently, when you think of the geopolitical issues we are in, and you already saw, for example, I think it was about end of last year in Kazakhstan, where the internet access was completely blocked and the Bitcoin price fell massively within hours, just because there was a blockade and the miners could not contribute to the mining process or the global mining process anymore. And that also shows the vulnerability of these kind of ledger technologies. Where suddenly a nation or a state can shut down the whole, I would say, contribution to these networks, to the security, to the validation of these networks. And we need to be very careful that we don't take this blockchain technology and the benefits of it for granted. So we need to be very careful about who is owning the nodes, especially when it comes to mining and verification in the distributed ledger tech. We need to be very aware, depending on the network we are using, who is contributing to this network, who owns the nodes, who is actually really the 50 or 51% owner, if you want to, of these networks. And ultimately, the one who can own 51% could potentially also, of course, change the immutability. So while you still think everything is tamper-proof written, the one with the majority can override it or actually can change the reality, let's say, like this. And then suddenly, worst case, you don't own the property anymore. Somebody else does. You don't transfer your cryptocurrencies to individual A, it's now individual B. So there are situations that could potentially happen because of the risks on a global scope.
When we talk about blockchain, initially, cryptocurrency was one of the things, but also there are a lot of documents that can be created. There are a lot of transactions that it can be used. So you can also talk about the scope of Bitcoin, so we can also understand, how widespread it could be.
So I would say the blockchain technology and the DLT technology, the cryptocurrency is of course the fanciest part, I would say. So a lot of people immediately know, oh, Bitcoin, Ethereum, the Solana or whatever. So you can actually invest, you can speculate, and you can make some money with it. But the DLT idea is about ownership. It's basically about that the ownership is cannot be manipulated, and the ownership is also not controlled by a state or by an intermediate or whatever. And therefore, we are not just speaking about cryptocurrencies. In the meantime, when you think about NFT space, a non-fungible token, then it's going to be the transfer of ownership of pieces of something whole. So let's say art, or let's say buildings, real estate. You could actually tokenize real estate, and then you can distribute it based on the blockchain technology. And The dangerous part is the more we advance into a system like this, the more risk is, of course, if somebody can break into this system or could manipulate the whole system. And the moment the financial world is already based and the ownership world is already based on a technology like this, it becomes, of course, extremely interesting, I would also say, to the bad players in the market to change the reality. And one important thing to mention as well is everybody needs, also enterprise companies, but also individuals need to think about applications, and if they really need to do blockchain based on Bitcoin, Ethereum, or other global markets, or if they just want immutability in a smaller scale. So there are also alternatives for single applications, for enterprise applications, even for dedicated applications across customers, marketplaces, and so on, where you don't need to sit on top of networks that are completely unknown to you, who is actually running it and operating them.
How much concern do you see are there from states or governments who do want to regulate it? Which do you think will help blockchain technologies, or it will hinder their scope?
The first initial reaction would be it will hinder, but the truth is probably it will help. Because whenever there is need for regulation, it also means there's a lot of adoption. So in the meantime, it's already becoming a kind of a problem, or it's worrying to existing industries, it's worrying to the existing government. And then the regulation eventually becomes a very good thing. So I think it's just this intermediate phase between unregulated and regulated that is very painful, with a lot of decisions that might or might not work out. And I think this is the path we are currently in, and the state we are currently in. And I'm sure the outcome will be positive, but there will be a lot of decisions that sometimes are also not really straightforward, or hinder, or even questionable. I can give you one example. In Europe, there was a request to stop all kinds of resource inefficient cryptocurrencies, so proof of work. And of course, you cannot just say, hey, okay, we are going to, in 2 years or in 3 years, we are going to stop cryptocurrencies like a Bitcoin from being allowed to or legal anymore, I would say. And they realized after a couple of weeks, this was definitely going too far. So they actually stepped back and changed the regulation and the laws again. So I think this is something what we are going to see very often, that something is just getting regulated too massive. And then the discussion starts if it's really realistic and usable, and then it's becoming much more relaxed, and eventually we come out with a good solution on it. But the big concern right now is, of course, what players are playing fair and what players are playing unfair. And that is one of the concerns right now when you think of now the situation with Russia, but also in China, where a lot of miners were actually located, and then the situation and the government changed its opinion. Then the miners are moving away. Some DLT networks becoming unstable or not really so trustworthy anymore. And that is definitely a scenario that you need to, or that all the governments need to take into account when regulating, that some cryptocurrencies or some stable coins, or maybe even governmental stable coins, can become a real threat to other countries' economies.
And let's look at a different aspect for this, that the more governments get involved, the regulations are there. Doesn't it also kind of, not essentially, but also because of this change geopolitical situation, where it will be more kind of protected as well? There will be similar laws, just the way in Europe, GDPR was there totally for different reason. It was, data, you keep your data here, it doesn't leave. So similarly with blockchain technologies also, governments are, nobody is more aware than governments about all these challenges that are there. So it might help versus unstructured, non-standard industries doing whatever they want to do.
I personally think, when we take GDPR as an example, the first design of GDPR was definitely not for a real world. So there's so much also that has been offloaded to government, to companies, but also even small town shops or the mom and pop shops or even a club suddenly needed to start having a huge administrative work to do. So everything has been relaxed again because it was just not feasible to, and then also not cost efficient to do. And the same is true for the DLT. So a lot of these applications, I would say, on top of blockchain, went also crazy. You could actually bet. You could start doing for forecasting. You can actually game and challenge other people for money and so on, and everything aside from the regulated market. So of course no government starts to like it because it's not taxable and so on. So there will be a lot of regulations for sure coming to also avoid these kind of tax leaks. That is going to happen for sure. But on the other hand, the more regulations, I would say the majority of people trusts a regulated market more than an unregulated market. So it's currently a little bit more of a wild west. And the moment it starts to mature, it needs to be regulated, so that not one big player can just pull out, do a rug pull, and then everybody else has lost all his money. So eventually for the adoption and the broad adoption, it needs to happen. But on the other hand, it's also about that you don't rely just on a couple of cryptocurrencies and blockchains. So the important part is to really see the whole technology that is moving forward and progressing with the DLT adoption. And that starts really from a financial sector, of course, but it also is about storing documents in a tamper-proof way, having technology where you can really validate and audit everything that happened in an organization, but also in the private spectrum. So I think the advantages that are going to happen, not just from a cryptocurrency perspective, but from a whole perspective when it comes to verifiable data and trusted data, to things like fake videos and so on, you could potentially stop them using these technologies and make news and make all kind of information much more trustworthy. So this is going to be for the better for sure.
I want to go back to the point of immutable data. I want to quickly understand how would you define immutable data in this context, so that we also understand that if there are states who can turn off the internet or block access, how it will affect. So just go to the very basics of immutable data.
So in a distributed ledger technology, of course, there are also different technology standards. So next to proof of work, where really some mining needs to happen, there's also proof of authority and other more, I would say, less CPU and less power consuming ways to verify. But a lot of these technologies are still centralized or partially centralized. So in these cases, you need to be very concerned about who owns these centralized systems that can ultimately control. So that is one piece of the I would say the bad part about DLT. So in general, you cannot just trust because somebody says it's DLT or it's blockchain. It could be still a single node, and because you only have a single entry point and there's not much behind it, or it's still running on one and the same hardware server. So there's so many varieties of different technologies out there right now that there are only a few where we know definitely 100% what is going on. There are a few, even like a Bitcoin or Ethereum, where we don't know 100% of the nodes. Where they operated, where can you find them? And then there are also technologies that run locally or in a consortium kind of setup. And when I think about immutable data, there are two issues. One thing is you can manipulate data. So you just change, for example, the recipient of your cash transfer. But it's also about deleting data. And the part with the manipulation you can achieve with different kinds of of technology. It doesn't need to be a distributed tech. There are different, like the immutability that we provide, but there's also technologies like Hyperledger, or there's technology like archiving solutions where you can have immutability, so nobody can change the data content. On the other hand, there's also the part of deletion, and that is where I think the DLT technology really comes into play. So you have systems you can't access. So if you delete it on system A, then system B and C and D, they still have it. And they can still validate, and as long as the majority is there, they can prove, okay, the data has not been deleted, it's still there. And that is, I would say, the main point of having these distributed technologies. So whenever you need immutable data, but you don't need the data as secure as being delete safe, I would say, or deletion safe, then you can also use different technologies as well.
I mean, this also brings a very important point when we do talk about, distributed system, not just about blockchain also. It does depend on, of course, we feel that, hey, with the distributed systems, data is spread across, so you don't have to worry about it. But how much chunk of data is where, that also depends. So this is also a kind of wake-up call for not just blockchain technology, but other distributed. There are a lot of other, players and other open source distributed technologies as well. They say, hey, it's all spread across the globe, so you don't have to worry about it. But should they also take into consideration these factors?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just because it's distributed, it doesn't mean it's really distributed. That's one thing. It could be distributed on one box, just different instances. It could be distributed and one party owns all of these systems. And then, of course, there's another thing when people speak about DLT technology, there's typically one endpoint where you send the data to, or maybe there are a couple of endpoints, and then it's being stored in a DLT setup. And these endpoints could actually simulate whatever they like. So there's, of course, always a way to, so even if the technology behind is really secure and extremely tamper-proof, it doesn't mean that the data reaches this point. So that is one of the things to look at. And the other thing is about the verification. You made a very important point. If you trust the backend, so basically everything that is part of the network, but you as a client, you just trust because the consensus is in the backend, it's only half of the puzzle, part of the puzzle. Because if the client cannot verify, then the server could be anything. And that is one of the bigger issues that I would see eventually, that there needs to be more and more, and in Bitcoin and Ethereum, you also have this kind of validators. So people that don't really earn any Bitcoin or so by mining, but they just do the validation part. And we need, of course, a lot of validators that are trustworthy. And that is pretty much true with all these technologies. You need not just the ones who contribute to gain money, you also need the ones that validate, just to make sure that the whole network is still intact. And the best solutions, in my opinion, is, of course, that every client can validate at least portions of this data as well. So you can be sure, no matter who owns the backend, you can still verify and detect, okay, something is fishy.
When it comes to players who are offering validation, what role do you think foundation, non-profit foundation, of course there are Apache, Linux Foundation, there are other foundations as well, they can play in there to kind of emerge as a neutral body so that you can trust them there? Once again, you're not rely on either one developer or vendor.
For sure. So as all kinds of associations that already do work on a global basis to create trust, and of course, then also interconnection. So, for example, non-competing or competing companies could also be in kind of sync of validation of the other parties doing, I would say. So I think there could be a lot, and there are a lot of ways how the validation is being done by associations that are already doing all kind of central validation in other cases. Or it could also be companies that create standards, for example. So there are so many ways how you can verify. The biggest issue is that distributed tech is so broad and there are so many things going on that, of course, you cannot protect and secure everything. So you need to actually come up with a top 20 or something like this, and then you need, of course, to do your own homework as well. Or if you're not sure about your own homework, then you need to ask somebody or you need to run it yourself. So it's definitely true. Validation needs to be, it would be horrible if only the ones that have interest in gaining validate the whole setup.
How much of these dangers are very well understood within the ecosystem, where it doesn't matter who is leveraging these technologies? Is it a very, very early age of folks are aware of it, but they're like, hey, no, it's not going to happen?
I think it's with all newer technologies that there's a kind of a hardcore team or a hardcore enthusiast that are there since day one. They have a much better understanding, of course. They are totally aware of the risks. And the more you are more of a consumer, I would say, or you just consume an app or you just want to run an app, the less you are aware of the setup and the weaknesses of the setup. And I really think that this is a very important part that people need to start thinking about when they choose distributed ledger technology for their applications, but also consume it, or when it comes to brokering, exchanging NFTs and whatsoever. You need to make sure that you understand at least the risks even if it's superficial, but you need to understand the risks of these different networks. And I personally think we are really early right now. So it's specialists and people that really dig deep, that understand it. But most of the people, even if the sources are open, most people cannot read the source code or understand the source code. I cannot find flaws in the source code. So at some point, you still need to rely on something. And then it's just about the history. How long is something untempered? Who is actually owning these nodes? And then last but not least, of course, do I really need a DLT for my applications? So that is one of these questions to ask yourself as well. It's like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So you always need to think about what kind of data do I really need to store there, and if it's super important data and I really need to have it tamper-proof, I still should actually think about what is the risk if this tamper-proofness is turning out to be untrue or it was not as strong as I thought.
Right, excellent. This last question could be hypothetical, totally out of context, and even be stupid, but do you think that the scope of these blockchain immutable data go beyond, some of those, specifically initially it was more about, protecting the ledgers from any changes in specific use cases. But in today's world, if you remember earlier, encryption was meant only for very, very sensitive, and now all the way from our mail to our messaging, everything is getting encrypted. Apple's, all the apps and everything. So do you feel that there will be a point, because it doesn't matter whatever transactions we do in the world where there can be fake videos or fake messages, that the scope of blockchain will grow and it might even become a default, because eventually that's what happens, right?
I personally am a firm believer of exactly what you mentioned. It's going to happen. Because eventually, if you ask yourself, if you could store data immutably or not immutably, and you only have one choice, you probably go for the immutable stuff, just to be on the safe side. And I personally think we are going to find solutions to have GDPR compliance in immutable data. We are going to find solutions to also connect different technologies with each other. So you don't need to have your data on a centralized or on a distributed blockchain somewhere accessible by the internet. Maybe you run it in your own data center and you have just one connection that writes the data once an hour or once a second to a public visible blockchain. So the ideas are already out there, and I'm a firm believer that in a couple of years, the immutable data will be more important than anything else. And you all can already see what damage manipulated data does in the news and so on. And it's also, of course, in this more distributed and non-custodian a way of money transfer, there's also, of course, a huge risk. And this risk basically can only be taken on if you have different technologies and you have not just regulated and a mesh of technologies, but also that you can mitigate the risk of the bad players by just having enough interconnectivity.
Dennis, thank you so much for once again joining us here and sharing great insights into the kind of dangers that people are more or less not aware of when it comes to blockchain technology. So thanks for sharing those, and I would love to have you back on the show again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Pleasure as always.